Hello everyone, and welcome to another OVA overview in between larger pieces. Today we're going to look at another anthology series, and this one, another one by Katsushiro Otomo. Now we've talked about this guy's works before when we did the Neo Tokyo video, which we unfortunately had to watch in the director's room due to Katakawa Pictures' love of copyright protection. However, if you don't know who Mr. Otomo is just by hearing the name Neo Tokyo, do know that he also made a little piece named Akira that inspired a few homages here and there. It was slightly successful from what I've heard. I don't know. Maybe I'll watch it one day. But anyways, we're not talking about Neo Tokyo today or Akira, but instead the 1995 spiritual successor to Neo Tokyo, which is Katsushiro Otomo's Memories. Now this is a little less experimental than Neo Tokyo, seeing as that there is no large sort of overarching little bits and pieces connecting all of the anthology stories very tangentially. Everything is clearly cut and divided here, but the piece is still as gorgeous and at times as experimental as Neo Tokyo. As a whole, I don't think it's as experimental, but that's because this is not supposed to be a sort of experimental venture like Neo Tokyo was. Instead, this is supposed to be a refined production which clearly proclaims its points and clearly displays its artistic mastery. There's no little connecting bits like in Neo Tokyo, just three complete standalone stories, each with their own developed worlds and characters to envelop us and really see how memorable this piece is. And it is a very memorable piece, as even though I have various opinions about all of the stories in it, I think that they're all very well executed and very memorable. I think that this is a piece which deserves a look through, so let's do that as we answer how this differs from Neo Tokyo, what there is to love about it, whether or not I can survive Katakawa Pictures' brutal copyright censors, and what makes this piece so memorable. Now, to get into things, this is an anthology, so as with other anthologies, I'm just going to try and do a very short summary of each of the stories, and then talk about the little bits and pieces that really stand out about them and why they're excellent, with little nitpicks scattered in here or there. This is a rather well-known piece for this channel, however, I still think it was an excellent watch, and as such, I just wanted to talk about it. Let's start with episode 1, Magnetic Rose. Magnetic Rose is a story about salvage workers in space who investigate a strange signal emanating from this mystical rose in space, only to figure out that it's a computer-ran satellite that is slowly trying to trap them in false memories. It's a very interesting premise as we see that this satellite was once the home of a reclusive opera prodigy who, after dying, left the system to run amok. As such, the computer, which actively recreated memories of her past to live in, has become lonely and actively seeks to bait people in by emitting a false SOS signal, something that the salvage workers responded to. Our two main characters are Miguel and Heinz, and they're also supported by the captain and the guy voiced by Uryu from Bleach in the Corona, which is their sort of mothership. As the story progresses, the computer attempts to sway both Heinz and Miguel with the false memories that it wonderfully portrays, and Miguel buys in. He's sold, and he's kind of tricked into living into this hologram fantasy land. Heinz is almost tricked. However, a picture of his child that falls from his wallet reminds him that he's still on the job and that nothing here is real. As such, he confronts the computer, proclaiming that it's simply a being trapped in memories that's not living anything near a real life. As such, he proceeds to try and shoot his way out of the station. He doesn't succeed per se. However, when we cut back to the mothership, we can see that it's slowly being sucked into the gravity well of the giant Rose space station. And realizing that something is horribly wrong, the captain decides to cut his losses and blow up the space station, figuring that Heinz can hopefully figure some way out and that they can't leave this thing unattended to bait more people in. Unfortunately, the Corona does explode and kill its crew members in this process. However, Heinz somehow survives, and we cut to a final scene of him drifting in space, thankful to be alive. Although we do end on kind of a somber note, noting that he is alone in space, and we don't necessarily know if he's going to be rescued. It's a very engrossing tale, as we see the power that memory has over all of the characters and how they deal with this. It feels a bizarre atmospheric mix of Cowboy Bebop and the movie Alien. It's nothing like those productions, but for some reason, the use of the very interesting soundtrack and the whole premise of salvaging in space reminded me of these two pictures very much. And it's interesting how it's set up as this kind of fantastical venture that later slips into a horrific venture into false memories and grieving. I like this gradual degradation of not only tone, but also how the setting mirrors it. We start off with very clean and elegant halls. We start off with the wardrobe of the Madame and her warm and cozy dressing room and personal quarters. And then as the series goes on and Hines and Miguel go further into the station, we get into its guts and the parts of it that are literally falling apart. We see all of the decay that is the actual state of the station, which makes us question how much of the original stuff that we saw was even real. The setting mirrors the gradual descent into madness and grief, which has possessed the computer and led it to try and prey on unsuspecting spacers. I really like how you initially expect the mess, only to be greeted by this Renaissance opera hall, and then the setting slowly devolves into the mess that you expected in the first place. It kind of subverts your expectations and gives you what you want at the same time. In addition to this, as everything slowly slides into a more dreary setting with more ghostly encounters and more uncomfortable elements, the movie itself also does an excellent job slowly slipping into the surreal. When we first see the Madame in the corner of our eyes, they clearly make a point of saying, oh guys, it's just a hologram program someone left on. And we see them go through her quarters and stuff fall apart, and it is kind of creepy, but then they're like, well, it is 80 years old because she died a long time ago by herself on this station. We get some genuinely creepy visuals from the first couple scenes, but nothing that is inherently surreal. However, as the computer makes itself more known and actively starts trying to manipulate the perceptions of Miguel and Hines, then we slip into the surreal. And it makes sense both logically and thematically, and I really love how consistent that is. It makes sense from a logical standpoint that, yes, they're saying some really weird stuff, but it is explained. And it also makes sense from a thematic standpoint because it kind of mirrors how everyone here is slipping into the madness of the station, mirroring the Madame's descent into madness, and just a general descent that isolation itself can bring. In addition, I want to compliment all the design work here, as the visuals are just gorgeous. I love how everything is drawn because it feels realistic, but kind of clunky in a prototype or early design work kind of phase. I like how the spacesuits are not just spacesuits, but also kind of envelop the characters with the robotic, blocky upper half. It's like the characters are inside a giant amoeba, and this kind of foreshadows how the space station itself literally tries to envelop and consume them. In addition, a lot of stuff just feels very practical and realistic, with the exception of the sideways chair in the Corona. What's up with the sideways chair? I get it, it's a cool visual quirk, and I love it, but practically, what is this chair doing? Getting to the characters of this piece, I really loved all of them, and I think that might actually be a point against the movie, but we'll get to that in a minute. Hines is a caring and reasonable family man. He's a professional that wants to get the job done, but he's not a square, and he's not necessarily a rude man either. He still values and respects all his coworkers, and is even something of an older brother figure to Miguel, a younger playboy who, while chasing after women, still seems to be a good guy and is still willing to get the job done and help those around them. I really like the dynamic between the two because Hines is obviously the senior, and he's obviously looking out for the younger Miguel, which mirrors not only Hines' role as the older man, but also as a dedicated husband and father. It makes sense that the family guy would kind of take on the leadership role here, and it makes sense that the single and younger Miguel is willing to learn from this older man and all of his experience. Miguel also just has a lot of funny lines and scenes. He's kind of like the comedic character here, but it never gets to the point of being goofy, and he does bring up some good questions, and they even do a good job foreshadowing his demise, as he always talks about chasing after women, and then the computer's illusions of the Madame kind of convince him to stay on the station. So him chasing after women, foreshadowed in the opening of the movie, does end up ironically being his downfall to some extent. I also really like the captain, who just serves as a gruff old man in the Corona, and I really like his assistant, the computer guy in the sideways chair, who's voiced by Uryu. That is Derek Stephen Prince. I noticed the voice instantly. He has one of those voices where you hear it and you're like, oh, that's Uryu from Bleach, and I looked it up and it's him. Even has a kind of a similar design too, which I thought was hilarious. But all the characters here are great, and I think that Magnetic Rose as a whole is great. I mean, it's a literal masterpiece, and I love how operatic it feels. Everything's kind of over the top. It's a story about passion and melancholy, and how living in the past and how being enveloped in all these things kind of consumes everyone involved. it does feel like a space opera, for lack of a better term, and I think that is a testament to how well it was written and how well it was executed. However, getting to the execution, I did mention that I liked the characters a little too much for this movie, and that's because since everyone is so likable, I can't 100% get behind the ending, and this is an entirely personal thing. I realize that from a thematic standpoint, it is a tragic ending and in that way beautiful and worthy of respect. However, did we really have to do all of the guys like this? Like, it just seems a little mean-spirited to me, and like, let's be honest, fuck that lady, or at least the computer that set all of this up. That's a personal quip of mine. I do think it's excellently written, and I do respect and understand the tragic element here, and how impactful that is. I mean, it did, after all, get me to feel bad for all of the characters that definitely did die, and probably will die in this piece. Magnetic Rose is a story about being trapped in the past, and it makes sense that everyone involved is trapped in the remnants of this station. And this idea of being trapped in the past also mirrors the name and overall theme of the anthology as a whole very well. One last quirk I'd like to get to before moving on to the other stories is that since it is about an opera singer living in a make-believe opera hall, it allows a lot of excellent opportunities to integrate the OST, or at least this segment of it, into what is actually happening in universe. And I love this kind of fourth wall stuff. What I mean by that is that not only is the OST something we hear as background music, but it's something actually happening in the actual scene. So like the characters in the scene can hear it too. I've always loved this kind of fourth wall breaking integration of the OST into both a character's perception and our perception, and being set in an opera hall, that kind of makes a lot of sense here, and I think they did a really good job utilizing that creative little quirk. That gets us to story 2, Stink Bomb, which is one of the most iconic OVA short stories ever. I'm pretty sure a lot of us have seen clips of this somewhere on YouTube or the internet, as there are a lot of iconic shots here, whether it's the tanks running along the ridge, or everyone just shooting at this young man on the bicycle. However, as iconic as it is, I don't know if the actual story is as well known. And that plot is that a young pharmaceutical employee takes an experimental drug to cure his cold, only to find that the pill he's taken actually turns him into a biological weapon that emits an extremely potent and toxic gas. He never seems to put two and two together though, and as such tries to rush to Tokyo in order to give his boss a paper about the pill, only to unwittingly spread destruction. Anyways, the story is then about how the government attempts to prevent him from accidentally killing everyone in Japan by first attempting to kill him, and then actually successfully capturing him. However, at the very end, we see that they capture him by placing him into a super sealed spacesuit that he unwittingly takes off while in the government offices, in effect killing all of the bigwigs who had spent so much time trying to corral him. For as iconic as all of the scenes that we've seen of this on YouTube or the internet at some point, Stink Bomb is one of the most confusing pieces I've seen in a while, and is also a very nebulous and vague one in some of its tones and intentions. I'll get to the tonal confusion later, but I'd first like to start off on how its commentary, while clear, isn't the most obvious. Now, this is a movie about a deadly gas spread from one person to everyone around him. And I think the nebulous and ill-defined form of a gas is a good metaphor for the military-industrial complex and its various influences that this movie seems to critique. As a whole, I think Stink Bomb is some kind of tongue-in-cheek criticism of both the military-industrial complex and Japan's military, its military history, and its relationship with America as a whole. It seems to want to try and poke and prod at all of these ideas without saying anything too blatantly, and overall I think that execution is actually done surprisingly well. I think the idea of spreading a toxic gas is a very fitting metaphor because gas doesn't have a really true form. It kind of just floats around and molds itself to everything around it. But it can still be perceived, and it can still be quite deadly and or impactful. And in this way, it kind of mirrors the nebulous but powerful influences that the military-industrial complex can have over an economy or a government or a society or something else. In this way, the criticism of the military and the military-industrial complexes does make a lot of sense in the context of the movie and what is both going on literally and what is both being said on a commentary level. However, this commentary, while seemingly straightforward, does have some layers to it, because it's not just the usual America is bad, we need to kick out the Americans and assert Japanese sovereignty once and for all again, which is something you do see in a lot of 90s anime here and there. In fact, a lot of 90s anime as a whole, if they do get political for some reason, often will have token American military advisors that are really sinister or condescending, and there will be some kind of commentary about the Japanese-American military treaties and Japan's place in the world as a great power that is restrained by its pacifist constitution. These are all commentaries present in a lot of 90s anime, and I do think it is done surprisingly well here because of all of the nuances. While there is the token sinister American military advisor, the piece doesn't go out of its way to simply say, America bad, Japan great, let's kick them all out. No, there is still nuance here. Getting to the veiled reflection on Japanese military expenditure and policy, though, a lot of subtle criticism is done not only of the Americans and their place in Japan, but also of the Japanese government and military. I did initially expect that the American guy would just kind of be an imposing and condescending dude who tells the Japanese how they should try and fight this problem and says, kill them all or something. But in fact, the stereotypical American role of being the brash, condescending guy is instead taken by one of the Japanese military advisors. We see that in this sort of meeting area. There's a few scenes where everyone talks about what to do. And there's this guy who is saying, you know what, whatever, just kill the guy, just kill the guy, just kill the guy. I don't care, he's human, we just gotta kill the guy, solve the problem. And I'm pretty sure he's Japanese because they make the American guys look really American. So I think this is kind of a commentary on perception of the military in Japan currently or at the time, but also maybe even its history and how the military's relation with Japanese society as a whole has not always been the most wholesome, let's say. There is a lot of subtle criticism of the Japanese military here, and I think it's most obvious in simply how everyone handles the situation. Everyone here is either super bloodthirsty or a complete wuss. And I don't mean that as an insult to the actual Japanese ground self-defense forces, but I'm simply saying that's how they're portrayed in this piece. We get men like Deskman here who says, let's just bomb the crap out of this dude, let's blow him up, solve the problem, what's one life on our hands? Or we get random NPC military guys on the ground who essentially say the same thing and cuss everyone out constantly. And then we also have various examples of random soldiers on the ground simply running away in panic as soon as something starts to go awry. Now, I understand that this is a very weird and threatening situation to be in, but it did seem a little insulting that these trained soldiers would just panic at the first sign of any kind of complication. It did seem like the series was going out of its way to kind of poke and prod at the Japanese military, which was very interesting to me because this feels like a kind of criticism of militaries as a whole and perhaps even Japanese history, seeing how incompetent and bloodthirsty a lot of the Japanese military personnel here seem to be. I also want to point out that this is further contrasted by how the American guy is actually portrayed. The American dude not only looks super dope, which, you know, that's just points for style, but is also the only guy who says, hey, maybe let's not kill this dude and see if we can, like, actually help him. Now, I will say that Mr. American does this out of a desire to save taxpayer dollars, so it's not like he's doing this out of altruistic reasoning, but he's still the only guy who says, let's actually see if we can try to fix this humanely and not just kill that guy. And ironically, this diplomatic solution is also the one that succeeds, at least for a short-term amount. It would have succeeded for a longer-term amount if someone told the guy not to take the damn helmet off. I don't know how they didn't say that. But the point is, the Americans, while helping cause the problem in this movie, because they did help fund the development of the pill, also were the ones that kind of solved it and still put a lot on the line to actually try and solve it. So the portrayal of the Americans here is kind of balanced. They do some good, they do some bad, and they also have sick designs. While the portrayal of the Japanese is surprisingly dour or negative here, as everyone is kind of a wuss or bloodthirsty, and everyone seems somewhat incompetent. It's a bizarre reversal of what I was expecting when I figured that this was a sort of commentary on the military-industrial complex and its place in Japanese society. It was also very interesting seeing this perspective from an anime, which is one that you don't necessarily see a lot. I've seen a lot more stuff where the American is just a bad guy and we gotta get him out, which, you know, I get it, our foreign policy is controversial at times, but I really do respect how open this piece is about its ideas and how it's a reflective piece. It feels very honest in that way. Something which doesn't necessarily feel honest to me, though, is the tone of Stink Bomb, which is also the main reason I didn't enjoy this piece as much as the other two. In fact, I think Stink Bomb is one of the most bizarrely polarizing pieces I've ever seen because I don't understand the tone that it was going for. The commentary is excellently done and it's subtle and well woven into the fabric of the narrative, but I don't know what the tone of that narrative is actually supposed to be. The punk jazz soundtrack and the goofy main character make me feel like this is supposed to be some kind of comedy. I mean, we get scenes where this guy's riding his bike Wile E. Coyote style while half the Japanese military tries to blow him up. And that feels kind of fun and whimsical. But then again, the reason they're trying to blow him up is because he has become a living weapon that's by this point probably killed hundreds of thousands of people. Now, he does say they're unconscious at some point, so I don't know if they're actually dead, but Wikipedia says they're dead, so I'm inclined to think that they might actually be dead. And if that's the case, well then this is also an extremely dark piece because it's about a man who unwillingly and tragically kills everyone around him simply by existing. As such, I don't know if it can succeed as a comedy in that light, but it's not serious enough to feel like anything else. Like, it doesn't feel like a thriller to me, but it doesn't feel like a super dark or serious piece either, but it seems like it's too dark to be a comedy, or even really a dark comedy. I mean, just how many people died in the story when we really think about it? And then you combine that with the supposedly comedic ending where half of Tokyo is now just gone in a few hours, and I'm really confused. I know that whoever directed this was not their first choice of director. I don't know if that really had an impact on the tone here, but it's a tone which I don't quite understand. And it is also something that feels rather mean-spirited at times. As noted earlier, a lot of the Japanese military personnel are pretty bloodthirsty, and the protagonist is too dumb to understand that people are trying to kill him, so it feels like we see a bunch of sharks trying to bite a seal in half or something. It doesn't feel pleasant a lot of the times, and it doesn't feel as fun as I feel the visuals should try to make it. Now, those visuals are beautiful and great, and I especially love all the scenes with all the moving machines because that's just cool, and this is complemented by its quirky punk jazz OST. However, I don't know if those two things are enough to really gloss over the tonal issues which still get to me and confuse me to this point. And while there are a few funny moments in Stink Bomb, I honestly can't say I enjoyed it as much as the other two pieces because I'm still confused about the tone here. I mean, that combined with a painfully dense main character and just how mean-spirited it feels at times make me say that while this is a very interesting piece with a well-done commentary, it's not necessarily the most entertaining piece to me. And it is something which is a little confusing and borderline frustrating at times. I don't know, it's in this weird mid-ground for me. It's still a very interesting and entertaining piece, but it's a piece that leaves me with a lot of more questions than I thought that it would. In addition, how does this connect to the theme of memory? I don't quite know. Maybe they need to remember that this guy's human or something, but I don't see how the theme or idea of memory really weaves itself into this narrative that much, which is an issue with the next story as well. And that next story is Cannon Fodder, by far the shortest and arguably the most effective piece here. A very blunt and very stylized commentary on the dangers of militarism as a whole. This is a blatant commentary on the dangers of militarism and just how it can degrade a society and the people in it. Now, for a quick plot summary, this is a little 20-minute piece which goes over a day in the life of a family living in a hyper-militarized city bristling with gun turrets. Father works as a loader on Cannon 17, mother works in a factory making shells for it, and son goes to school where he's brainwashed into becoming a willing and loyal soldier for the city. All the while, we are surrounded by various instances of slogans, political officers, political repression, economic repression, and just hyper-militarized totalitarian imagery. This imagery is great, as it is very obvious what Cannon Fodder is going for. This is a horrible, worst-case scenario of your state has become super militarized, and now the military consumes every aspect of you and your family's lives. They do a great job building this setting up, as it's very fantastical with all the gun turrets, and all of the colors, and the visual styling as a whole, and yet the setting is also very grounded because there's obvious homages to real-life totalitarian governments here. It seems to be mostly German-inspired, as noted by certain letters in the made-up alphabet here. If you know, you know. Although there is also influences from other totalitarian regimes present. The presence of various political officers or commissars, which reminded me of the Soviet dictatorship of the past. The atmosphere as a whole is tremendous. It really shows how living in a militaristic dictatorship kind of just sucks for everyone involved. All of the adults are zombies who are so worn out by the constant demands of the state upon them that they don't really question anything anymore, not only because they're exhausted, but also because they've simply been beaten and crushed in the following the system present. They're too exhausted to do anything but live at this point, and they're not really human. Everyone feels kind of like a zombie, and we see that in both the mother's constant focusing on relatively small trivial matters, i.e. she's kind of turned a blind eye to everything as a coping mechanism, and in how tired and exhausted the father always looks and feels at all times. He's being worn ragged by this state that asks so much of him. That's not to say all of the adults are zombies though, as we see that this dictatorship is great if you're on top. We see this in the presentation of the battery commander, a very pompous and commanding fellow who seems to exert an enormous amount of influence and power over those under him, all the while manning the cannon in a ceremonial role to make sure that we know that he's in charge. They do a good job of making this guy seem as pompous, as self-important, and as ludicrous as possible. And the fact that he looks nothing like his painting is an excellent criticism of how cults of personality worship people who are nowhere near as virtuous as the cult seems to portray them as. In fact, the power of a cult of personality, or a cult of state if you will, is also another thing that this piece comments on, as we see the effective brainwashing of the son in it. And this is the most chilling aspect of this piece, because the son seems to be fully on board with everything. He has a very militarized education. I mean, just cut to the scene in the school where they're literally teaching trigonometry just so these guys can get really good at artillery aiming. And we understand that the state is not only asking and draining all of it can from its citizens, but also from its future citizens. It's a thrillingly disturbing example of how youth organizations are set up in these kind of dictatorships to try and mold future generations into becoming the next wave of that dictatorship. It's very chilling just seeing this very blatant example, especially because we see the boy in other scenes and realize that he does seem to be just a normal kid. It's just that he's a normal kid growing up in a society that wants to transform him into a weapon of war and is dedicating an immense amount of resources into convincing him that that's also what he wants to be. It's a very disturbing and surprisingly real aspect of this piece, and one of the reasons I think that Cannon Fodder is the most effective of the pieces. Cannon Fodder is extremely blunt to the point where I respect it. It's given up on all pretexts of subtlety, and I think it does that intentionally. It tries to match the blunt and blustering nature of a dictatorship by being as blunt and as blustering with its themes and ideas. It openly mocks the idea of dictatorships, and it openly displays why they're horrible for the people that are forced to live in them. I thought it was pretty effective. I could see this being aired in classrooms or something, and the teacher going, "What do we see here? Why is this bad?" And people engaging with it. I think the fact that it's blunt is a strength of it, and I don't think that this is the kind of piece that needs subtlety. I mean, even the OST is very open about how it mocks dictatorships, as it uses a lot of marches used in very unepic ways. When you hear a march, you expect an army proudly marching through a conquered street or something, but instead we get this one fat dude trying to walk as stiffly as possible so that he can fire a gun at a target we don't even see. In fact, I want to point out that we don't see any enemies or even a possible enemy attack at all in this picture, because a lot of dictatorships, while being militaristic and aggressive towards other nations, also are aggressive and bullying towards their own people. I would even postulate that there might not even be an enemy in this scenario, as it seems like this idea of a forever war might simply be something posited by the ruling class in order to exploit it in order to stay in charge, i.e. create a crisis and then exploit that crisis in order to further your own gain. Real Palpatine level moves here. I can't confirm that there's no enemy in this picture, but it feels like that to me. Another thing we see is how expressionist everything feels, which is something else that fits in line with the German influences here. And I also want to say that I think this might just be one long shot. When I watched Cannon Fodder for the first time, I was wondering to myself, man, this camera is moving around a lot. It's making me a little dizzy. What's up with that? And then I realized I think that's intentional because I think they were going for some kind of single long shot production. I can't confirm if this is one long shot, but it does feel like it is, and if it is, that's incredibly impressive for reasons that I think are obvious. Long uncut shots are just very hard to do, even in animation, and if that is the case, then they did a very good job constructing a coherent narrative, all the while avoiding any kind of hard cuts. And that's all I really have to say about Cannon Fodder. It's a very blunt, effective, and even educational piece that I think everyone should watch, even if you don't necessarily find it the most entertaining. It's something that raises some questions in our civic brain, and something which can elicit a lot of good questioning and conversation. Getting to the closing conversation of Memories as a whole, I want to say really quick that they have like this epic club song for the credits, which I really liked. I didn't know where else to put that, but I think Memories is very memorable. It's not nearly as experimental as what preceded it, i.e. Neo Tokyo, and it's not nearly as impactful as that obscure movie Akira that this guy also made, but it's still something that has memory space in a lot of people's brains, and I think that's deserving, as while it does lack the connecting bits from Neo Tokyo, and thus feels less experimental, it feels instead more like a more polished piece. I did like Neo Tokyo, and I will go on record as saying it is an excellent example of style becoming substance, but it's undeniable that that piece doesn't necessarily feel the most coherent. This piece, however, while lacking interconnecting bits, feels extremely coherent. There's three very interesting stories, back to back to back, that do a great job keeping our attention. And I want to say that they all feel a lot longer than they do in the best way possible. That's not to say that they drag, but to say that they're executed in such an engrossing way that every second is truly engaging, and thus stuff like Magnetic Rose feels more like an hour and a half as opposed to 40 minutes. My only real nitpick about this anthology as a whole is I don't quite understand the connecting through line of memory. And maybe you guys can help me in the comments about this, but I don't see how the second or third pieces really connect to this through line. Magnetic Rose sets up the idea great, because it's a story about people being literally trapped by memories, and how living in the past is something which will destroy your future. I get it, excellent connecting theme. I don't necessarily understand how Stink Bomb and Cannon Fodder connect to these two things, though. I think with Stink Bomb, maybe they're trying to say, like, remember Japan's past follies, or remember the dangers of the military getting too powerful in civil society, or maybe even remember the fact that the guy who is the Stink Bomb is still a human at the end of the day. However, I feel like that's grasping at straws. I don't necessarily see how it connects to the idea of memory as a whole, although maybe those tangential links were something they were trying to build upon. Cannon Fodder is something else that I don't necessarily see the memory connection to, although I think there is a more tangible one here, as it is a Japanese piece that comes from a country which has experienced totalitarian dictatorships. I mean, Japan did do the whole World War II thing. That dictatorship did not end well. So maybe they were trying to say, hey, remember this thing that we did, and remember why it's a really bad idea. If that's what they were going for, then I think that that is a defined enough link to the theme of memory for my liking. I still don't understand where Stink Bomb fits into this, though, and I think that overall they could have linked Cannon Fodder and Stink Bomb more to the central theme or idea more, but, you know, I understand that they had a creative vision here, and that tweaking it to a certain extent to meet a thematic idea may have compromised the stories themselves to an unacceptable degree. As for an overall assessment of the pieces, Magnetic Rose is honestly great. It feels like a real operatic tragedy, and I think this easily could stand as a movie on its own, even though it's not full production length, although in a full production length of this little story would be fascinating to see. Stink Bomb still confuses me to this day, and I don't necessarily think I liked it too much, although I did find his commentary on the military very interesting, and I think it could have been done better if they nailed the tone down, which is something which, in my opinion, they didn't really do, but, you know, you tried, and it still has a lot of great visuals, it's still iconic, and it's still a very interesting piece for the tonal reasons that I mentioned earlier, as even if I don't know what the tone is, the fact that I don't know what the tone is still a talking point. And Cannon Fodder is a bizarre, stylized, but also very blunt and effective moral piece, serving as both a warning against the dangers of totalitarian dictatorships, and also as a teaching tool to try and get us to ask questions about society and how to avoid these things, how to truly freedom our own rights as human beings. And something else that we should truly treasure is this series of short stories. They are truly all memorable in their own right, even if not necessarily for all the best reasons. I'm looking at you, Stinkbomb. But nonetheless, I'm very glad to have watched this, and I think that anyone who likes anime probably would like this. They're all very beautiful pieces, they're all very capable of standing on their own, they all have great, excellent OST work, and they all have a lot of memorable moments and beautiful, well done visuals. It's another fascinating compilation piece that we've seen here, and even if it is less avant-garde than Neo Tokyo, it is by far a very worthy successor to that experimental piece, and another excellent work by Mr. Otomo. It is, after all, another excellent example of a bunch of great, obscure anime memories.